coliseum filled with saints that are encouraging those who are running. Can you get that picture? It almost seems like that, doesn't it? Therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, so you can get the picture of those running the race of faith, and around them are this congregation of onlookers, but not just to view what's going on, but to encourage them. They encourage them by their lives, saying, keep going, you can make it. We're not gonna fail. We're gonna finish strong. So we lay aside every weight of sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the source and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that lay before him endured a cross, despised the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God's throne. Previously, we have seen the first leg of the race, and I shared with you that it's like a 4x relay, 4x100, let's say. And the first leg of the race was run by those who were pre-flood, and that was Abel, Enoch, and Noah. And then what they did, they passed the baton of faith on. Now, when I share with you the faith baton, I'm talking about their death. The baton, picture the baton as being their death. At the end, their death is the baton of faith that they pass on to those who come after them. You got the picture? They passed it on to the patriarchs. And the patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In our passage this morning, we're also seeing Joseph being included. So those three passed on the baton to the next group. And then from there it went on to the children of Israel, and then finally Christ and all those who run the race trusting him. Now they passed on the baton, this baton of faith. Not only did they run the race and doing so for their own salvation as individuals, but for every child of God before them and after them, collectively, as a body or a family or a team. So they lived a life of faith, not having received all the promises, but knowing that they were still there. And they pressed on toward those promises. And they finished their leg of the race faithfully. And while facing death, they passed the baton of faith to those who would continue the race after them. Now, what if they dropped the baton? What would happen? Well, back in 2008 in the Beijing Olympics, our men's and women's U.S. team, the 4x100 teams, both of them that year in that Olympics dropped the baton. They were both expected to win, but in the process they dropped the baton and lost their race. They even said this, practicing the 4x100, the passing of the baton became the most dreadful part of their race. But not for us who run the race of faith. It's not a dreadful thing for us through our death to pass the baton of faith to those who come after us. We will finish strong. I want you to notice this in this passage this morning. I want you to notice this. Notice that it's referred to, all three of them, it's referred to as the end of their lives. So you can get the picture of them in their death passing the baton. Now they could have fumbled the baton, but they didn't. Why? Because God made sure, even with their imperfections, that they would finish strong and pass the baton of faith on to the next generation. The promises of God were passed on to their children by faith, always by God-given faith, and not human works. It's the work of God. You see, all of God's works that he does through us is tainted by our human nature and susceptible to failure. But we'll notice in Jesus, there was no failure whatsoever. He was the epitome of trusting God and living his life. You and I are the same way. We also trust God with our lives as we run the race. And when we come to the end and the baton has to be passed, don't worry about fumbling it. God will be sure that baton gets passed on to those who come after us. Why? Because the faith he's given us is not the result of our ability, but his. And as we looked at last week, God is able in all things. So when you come to the end of your life and you think at that time you're going to be a failure, even in the middle of your life you're going to be a failure, don't worry about it. God who lives in you will not be a failure. What he began in us, he promised that he would what? He would finish it. Why? Well, let's look at our outline this morning. Why will we finish strong? And why will we faithfully pass on the baton? Number one, God is trustworthy even though we fail. Isn't that a wonderful promise? God is trustworthy even though we fail. Now, Isaac is the longest living of the patriarchs. And who are the patriarchs again? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are three patriarchs. Now remember, after the patriarchs come the children of Israel. From the children of Israel comes the Messiah. So after the patriarchs, we'll see, beginning next week, those who are the children of God and those who were a part of the nation of Israel. So we see that Isaac, the longest living of the patriarchs, has the least amount of ink in the book of Genesis. He has basically chapter 25, 26, and 27, a portion of chapter 25, 26, and 27. And now in one verse, in verse 20, what we get is a mentioning at the end of his life. Now what I want you to see about Isaac is this, letter A, where he failed. He probably was the weakest of faith of all the patriarchs. He failed often. Letter A, he failed because he didn't learn to trust God's protection. So that's what I want to encourage you to do. This morning, always trust God's protection. God made a promise to Abraham. And that promise of being a great nation, having many offspring, was also passed on directly from God to Isaac. God said it to Abraham, and he also said it directly to Isaac. Now, if God told me something like that, and it was that clear, that concise, that faithful, consistent with everything else God said, wouldn't you and I have the confidence of knowing that God is going to finish it? What if God told you clearly, with no uncertainty, that he was going to continue to use you at the age of 90? How long do you think you would live? I hope you would be confident that you would live to the age of 90. Now, God made this kind of promise to Isaac. He said, Isaac, you are going to have many offspring. And now I want you to notice what Isaac does. In chapter 26, verses 3 and 4, the Lord appeared to him. It was during a drought, and he said, and a famine. He said, now don't go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you about. Stay in the land as a foreigner, and I will be with you and bless you. For I will give you all the lands to you and your offspring. And I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your offspring all the lands. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring. At that point, he has no offspring, but God has a promise. You're going to have a lot of offspring. Well, in the famine, he went to Gerar and had the promises that God would protect him. But notice what happens right away. I mean, we're talking the end of verse 4, where God made these promises, to verse 7. When he got there to Gerar, when the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, she is my sister. And why did he say that? He was afraid to say my wife, thinking the men in the place would kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is a beautiful woman. So here he is thinking, this beautiful woman that I'm married to, they want her. If I claim that she's my wife, they're going to kill me so they can have her. And so he lies about it. Now, for you and me, that seems like nonsense, knowing that God already promised that he was going to have a large offspring. Here, basically what he's saying, God, I don't trust you to take care of me and fulfill the promise you've made to me. That's quite a failure in faith, isn't it? But did God still use Isaac? Well, I'll tell you what he did. God even used Abimelech, the king at that time, to protect Isaac. Basically, he said this, Isaac, I know what you just did. You were caressing this woman's hair. That's not your sister. Brothers and sisters don't caress each other's hair. That obviously is your wife. Now, they might pull each other's hair, but they don't caress it. And so I know this is your wife. Now, he went to the whole kingdom and said this, anybody who harms Isaac will be killed. See, God even worked in a king that didn't even know God to protect Isaac. You realize that God will protect you and me no matter what? And every promise he's made to us, he's going to fulfill. And we can count on that. So I'm thinking, Isaac, what have you done? Have you failed to remember what God said to your dad Abraham? Did you fail to remember what he said to you? Come on. If God made these promises, he's going to fulfill them, and he'll take care of you until they are fulfilled. Letter B, we need to learn to trust God's will. Look at verse 20, the first part. It says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. So at his death, how did he bless his sons? He told them that God was going to use them likewise. Now, one was who? Jacob, and one was Esau. Who did he like? He liked Esau. You know why? Because he was self-centered, and Esau made some great stew. And his stomach was his king. And Esau knew how to take care of his stomach. He was pretty self-focused, self-absorbed. And I believe this. He knew by this time when he blessed his boys, he knew from the boys whom God was going to bless. He knew from his wife whom God was going to bless above the others. He knew that the oldest one was Esau, and that traditionally, culturally, Esau should have been the one who was blessed. Instead, it was Jacob who was going to be blessed. And through that whole process, what a mess his family was. Not only was he a mess, but his family was a mess. They deceived their dad, their husband. They deceived God's patriarch. Esau knew what God's will was. I have no doubt in my mind. He knew what God's will was, that Jacob would get the blessing, but instead he chose to bless Esau. But we know through deception, when he pronounced the blessing on Esau, it was actually Jacob in his Halloween costume. And he went ahead and blessed him. Well, kind of. He was obviously dressed up. But in the end, we need to realize this. Those twin boys played an important role in God's plan. Now, God blessed those boys not because of anything they have done, but because of his faithfulness. Certainly, Jacob did not earn that blessing. Esau was not the one to be blessed, but God still blessed them both. Remember, God blesses those who what? Seek him. Right? Isn't that the verse we memorized this month? God blesses those who seek him, not those who are perfect in their faith, but those who seek him. In the end, his faith blossomed. He knew God's will, that it was going to be accomplished in spite of the foolish things that he had done or his family had done. Are you confident of that? That God's will is going to be done no matter how you and I mess it up? No matter how foolish we are in the choices that we make and the things that we do? And letter C, learn to trust God's future. Look at verse 20, the last part. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning the things to come, the future. See, he didn't pass on tangible things like, the chariot and the tent house that they had, or any of his tools in his shed. He passed on a faith, a thing hoped for, the things God promised that would certainly one day be fulfilled. He blessed them. He sanctified them by setting apart. He set apart his sons for God's purpose, concerning the promises God made to him and also their grandpa Abraham. You see, that's the most wonderful thing you and I could leave for those who come after us, especially our children. It's not going to be the tangible material things that you pass on to them that they're going to be blessed by, but it's the faith and confidence you have in a future. God's future. That's what our children need. That's what our grandchildren need. That's what those who are under our care need more than anything. I think of little Peter. That's what Peter needs more than anything. Well, right now he probably needs certain things that you're going to take care of, but at the end, Robin, Peter's going to need to know that he can trust God no matter what. Trust God even when we fail. He blessed the younger, and when he did not revoke it, did he? But he trusted that God would fulfill his purpose even though he didn't understand why Jacob was chosen over Esau. See, God's not interested in us doing everything perfectly, but to trust him, no matter if we do it wrong. See, sometimes we arrogantly or ignorantly assume that the will of God depends on us. And you can hear it sometimes in the way we express ourselves. For instance, when we go out to evangelize, what if I say the wrong thing when I'm witnessing? Hey, you might say the wrong thing. But can't God use that? Can't God use that still? I remember we used to do a faith evangelism presentation, and we used the word faith, forgiveness, available, impossible, turn, and heaven. And we explained each of those letters. And then one of the ladies that I was in a group with, she was being trained, and she gave him the F, she gave him the A, and then she went on to give the T and the H, and she forgot the I. She blew the presentation. But that lady she was speaking to came to the place of repentance and trusted Jesus Christ as her Lord and Savior. And she forgot how to spell faith. You see, it doesn't depend on us. All that depends on us is that we seek God and we're doing what God wants us to do. And trust him, no matter how many mistakes we might make. What if that's not the exact truth? I've learned now what God was really meaning to say there, right? That happens. What about if you choose the wrong school or vocation or maybe the wrong spouse? Trust God. Trust God. He can even make that marriage the most beautiful and wonderful marriage possible. See, God's not up in heaven saying, now what am I going to do? Let me tell you, that Ed is more work than he is worth. See, these things don't surprise God. He's basically saying, he's not more work, he's my piece of work. And I will work through him. Okay, number 2. God's trustworthy even though we die. Remember Jacob, what's his name, his new name at the end of his life? Jacob becomes who? And the children of Israel. Jacob becomes Israel. So Jacob, we are told, in letter A, he's trusting God. Trusting God is important to pass on. He found out at the end of his life that trusting God was important to pass on. Look at verse 21, the first part. By faith, when he was dying, what did he do? Well, he passed on his confidence and trust in God. See, in his faith, the promises passed on to him from Abraham to Isaac. He did not see fulfilled in his time. And he passed them on to his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph. You see, even when he was dying, he knew that there was a confidence and a trust in God that he needed to pass on. See, he received blessings from his father, him being the younger one. Manasseh, who was the younger one of Joseph's children, was also the one who was blessed over Ephraim. The same as the case in Esau and Isaac. They were blessed in the wrong order. Remember when he was blessing them? What did their dad do when Grandpa was blessing them? He had his hands out and he crossed them over and he said, "Whoa, wait a minute! You got this backwards. Let's turn this around." He said, "No, we're going to have to trust God. This is what God wants done." And by faith, he trusted God and he blessed those boys. He was pretty much blind at the end of his life too. But he knew that no matter what he was going through, that he could trust God, and one thing he wanted to do was pass on to those who come after him that there's a confidence and trust that they needed to have in God. Letter B. He also passed on worshiping God is important to pass on. Look at letter B. Blessing each of the sons of Joseph, and he worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. That's just a phrase meaning worship, when you lean on your staff. Back in the Old Testament, Genesis, it says that he was at his headboard. It just simply means that he was worshiping God. See, basically trusting God. And that's worship, when you and I trust God. And he was passing this on to his child, Joseph, as well as his grandchildren. This was his bucket list. I mean, how many of you have a bucket list? Does it include passing on the confidence that we have in God in a way that we worship him and trust him? What do you mean by worship him? Well, let me just sum it up this way. Worshiping God is giving God our best. I can imagine he told those boys when he was worshiping, "Boys, what you need to do, you need to give God your best." Why? Because he's worth it. That's where worship means someone's worth. He's worth it to give him your best. See, even though everything depends on God, we work as though it all depends on us. Does that make sense? Everything depends on God. But you and I work and serve and give as though it depends on us. And that's something that needs to be passed on to those who come after us. In his death, he wanted to be buried in a land of promise that God gave to them. Not in Egypt where he died. He wanted to be where Isaac and Abraham were buried. And the grace of God sustained him through his life in any circumstance. And especially was his grace amazing at his death. To give God praise at the moment you and I die is one of the chief opportunities of old age. I don't know if you've been around someone who's been a saint all their lives, who walked with God, knew the Lord, served him, worshiped him, honored him, and they came to their death. My, that was such a blessed experience for me. I've been in the hospital with such saints that have been dying. I've been involved in the hospice care of such saints that were dying. And every single one of those situations of faithful followers of Christ, those were blessed moments. They were giving God the glory if they could speak right at that moment. And even if they didn't, I knew something must be going on in their head. They were still giving God the glory. I hope when you come to that time in your life and God grants you to be old, that will be one of your chief privileges, is to worship God before you close your eyes, breathe your last, and your heart ceases to beat. In his death, he was trusting God. And how could he trust God in his death? Well, think about it. He's experienced death before, not personally, but we do know that in his mind, Joseph was dead, wasn't he? Joseph was dead, but unbeknownst to him, God was still at work. Joseph was alive. And God was working in that boy's life. In his mind, it seemed like it was over, but in reality, God was still at work. There are probably many things that you want to accomplish before you end your life, or your life is ended. Hope you don't end your life, but your life is ended. There's probably some things you want to accomplish. But there's really only one thing that matters. That in all things, you and I will be found trusting God and no one else. I don't trust me. I don't trust you. Isn't that what Jesus said? I trust myself to no man. But I do trust the faith that lives in us. I do trust the God who lives in us. Does you get my point? I don't trust you. I don't trust me. But I do trust the God who lives in us. And that's a confidence that we have. And that's something we need to pass on to those who come after us. Even in our death, I trust God. All right, third thing. God is trustworthy even though it's difficult. Trust God even though it's difficult. You need to trust God during the highs and lows of life. You know what the highs and lows are, right? I mean, when a baby's born, that's pretty high. But going through all the pain and suffering and sleeplessness, that's a low. Now think about it. Look at verse 22, the first part. By faith, Joseph, when he was nearing the end of his life, remember again, end of your life, passing the baton. How exciting would a roller coaster be if it stayed at the same level throughout the whole ride? It bore me to death. How exciting is it that it goes straight up, goes straight down, whips around, and some of them even flip you upside down. That makes it exciting. Well, look at your life like a roller coaster. Those ups and downs are opportunities for us to experience something exciting. And no doubt in my mind, Joseph knew the ups and downs of life, and he certainly lived an exciting life. Notice in Genesis, but just prior to his death, it doesn't talk much about his life in this passage as it does his death. But just prior to the passage about his death, we see that his brothers come to him in chapter 50 and say, in verse 16, so they sent a message to Joseph before he died. Your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph, please forgive your brother's transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when their message came to him. Then his brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. I am in the place of God. This has been a roller coaster. It's had its ups and it's had its downs. But I know this has been exciting because God's been doing all of this. God has been at work. See, you planned evil against me, but God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. By the end of his life, all that he went through, he could say, God meant it for good. Even the bad choices people made against me, even the arrogant attitude I had when I was 17 years old, God still worked it for good. Isn't that the promise that we have? He was Dad's favorite son. He made a wonderful coat for him. And then his boys were jealous. He was arrogant, in my opinion. Look at me, boys. You know what? All of you are going to bend down and bow down and worship me. And, his brothers, you know what they did. They left him for dead. It wasn't soon that a caravan of travelers were coming by, heading to Egypt, and they gathered up this boy out of the pit and got to Egypt, and they sold him as a slave. He eventually made it to a great occupation in Potiphar's house. He was the caregiver of the house, took care of all those things. God had him in a pit, got him out of a pit, gone to slavery. Now he has a great job. And while he was serving in this great job, he was lied about by Potiphar's wife. And guess what happened to him next? Zoom, he went again. And he was in prison. While he was in prison, he met the cupbearer and the baker of Potiphar. And they told him dreams. The cupbearer told him a dream, and he said, in 3 days, you're going to be out of here. And then the baker said, you know what, I want to hear about you. I had a dream too, but please interpret mine. He said, well, it's not going to be so good for you. You know that bread that's on your head? The birds are going to eat it, and that's what's going to happen to you. He's going to have your head, and you're going to be hanged, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. But we do know the cupbearer got out. And Joseph, before the cupbearer got out, said, would you do me a favor? Would you remember me when you get out? Say a kind word to me, for me? And when he did, what happened? He was forgot about in prison. Eventually, he got out of prison through the gift God gave him of interpreting dreams, and he became the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. Do you know that coaster ride he must have been on throughout his life? But God took care of him. And he trusted God during those highs and those lows. Letter B, trust God at his word. Trust God at his word. Look at the latter part of verse 22. He mentioned the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave instruction concerning his bone. Notice what I said. He mentioned the exodus or the deliverance. Now, who better knows about deliverance being in the land of Egypt than Joseph? See, there's no record in the Bible that God gave him this word that there would be this deliverance. But God did give such a word to his great-grandpa, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his great-great-grandpa, Abraham, back in chapter 15, verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be foreigners in a land that does not belong to them, and they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. However, I'll judge the nation they serve, and afterwards they will go out with many possessions. So, this obviously was passed on to Abraham, passed it on to Isaac. Isaac passed it on to Jacob, and then to Joseph. And guess who else it got passed on to? Who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. It was passed on to Moses too. So in other words, they had the word of the Lord passed on to them. What do you and I have in the Bible today? Something God said directly to us? No, it's something God said directly to someone who passed it on to us. But we always need to remember God expects us, and by faith, we trust him at his word. And so at the end of his life, what does he mention? What God had been saying to great-great-grandpa Abraham, and now he passed it on to them. So he said, I too want to be buried in the promised land. He had a confidence that God was going to be faithful to his word. I hope you have that same confidence. In verse 24 of chapter 50, he says, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land, and to the land he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Now get this picture. You are to carry my bones up from here. Who could possibly ever keep track of a bag of bones for over 400 years through all of those moves? If you have ever had the opportunity to pack up your house and move, how many things disappear? Or you forget where you placed them. It happens all the time, doesn't it? Well, this is over 400 years. They have his bag of bones. They went from house to tent to house in all these different places. And in the end, guess what happened? Did they lose the bones? No, God made sure those bones got buried in the promised land. We see that in Joshua chapter 24. Joseph's bones, they still had Joseph's bones. They had this bag rattling with them all through the wandering in the wilderness, crossing over the Jordan. All this time. I mean, it was probably on their back when they were walking around the city of Jericho. And when they got there, they buried the bones, just as Joshua 24:32 tells us. And this is the conclusion this morning. And everybody said amen. Learn from those who lived a life of faith. That's why we have this hall of faith in here. Learn from those who lived the life of faith. And don't wait to apply the lessons of faith to when you die. Take these lessons that we were taught this morning and apply them now. God's plan is not ruined. God's plan will continue. God's plan will be fulfilled through Him working it. Next. It's faith that pleases God. He likes to see His faith at work in us. Not executing everything perfectly. And if you don't execute perfectly, don't worry about it. You're not going to thwart God's plan. His will be accomplished. The faith that He started in you, be confident of this: when you die and you're ready to pass on the baton, it'll still be there as strong as ever. See, you may not finish strong. In this passage I read this morning, all of them were failing physically. Their eyes had failed. 2 of them were almost blind. But God, who was at work in their lives, sustained them. No matter how much around them or physically was failing. And you can almost see a blind man leaning on a staff trying to pass the baton. And God says, I'll take care of that. And the baton was passed. Be confident of this. That faith that lives in you is the most important thing you have to pass on to others. And God will be sure that those who seek Him please Him. And that baton will be passed on. And those who receive it, God will use for great, mighty, powerful things. But you don't have to wait. Right now, you and I can live by faith, seeking God in all things. Father, thank you